Fake HOA enforcers smashed Bob Hastings' federally protected mailbox and slapped him with a bogus $750 fine. Led by the smug HOA president Mark Redding, the fake compliance patrol had been bullying elderly neighbors for months. But Bob, a retired postal inspector, had powerful federal allies ready to strike back. And just wait until you hear how this showdown ended, and why justice prevailed in the most satisfying way. It was a crisp Tuesday morning when Robert Bob Hastings opened his front door, coffee mug in hand. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and ocean breeze. Just another quiet day in the Florida community where he'd retired after 3 decades as a federal postal inspector. But the sight that greeted him stopped him cold. His mailbox, an official federally issued USPS curbside unit, lay in splinters. The post had been sheared off at the base. The metal door hung from a single twisted hinge. Deep, fresh tire tracks carved through the patch of grass where the mailbox had stood for over 10 years. Bob's first thought wasn't anger, it was disbelief. He blinked, then scanned the scene. Standing by the curb were 2 men, both in matching navy blue polo shirts with the words HOA Compliance Patrol stitched in yellow thread across the chest. Neither wore a visible badge of any real authority. One of them leaned casually against a large black SUV, whose tread matched the gouges in Bob's lawn. The taller of the 2, square-jawed, wearing wraparound sunglasses, straightened as Bob stepped onto his porch. "This box was out of spec and an eyesore," the man barked, his tone practiced and sharp. "You'll be fined, and if you reinstall it, we'll remove it again." For a moment, Bob simply stared. The cold morning air felt suddenly thinner. Federal property, destroyed, right in front of him. Bob's training kicked in. He quickly suppressed the surge of adrenaline. "Are you out of your minds? That's federal property," he said evenly, voice like steel beneath the calm. The second man, a wiry, narrow-faced type clutching a clipboard, snorted in reply. He had a faint smirk, the kind that people wear when they think they're untouchable. "You people think the feds run everything," the man sneered. "This is our community. We enforce the standards here, not the post office." Bob studied them. No official credentials, no sheriff vehicles, just 2 local thugs in polos acting like they ran the street, and they'd left clear evidence of their act. He wasn't about to argue with fools. He was about to document them. Without a word, Bob pulled out his phone and began snapping pictures. The smashed remains of the mailbox, the men, the SUV's license plates, their so-called uniforms. The taller man took a step forward. Bob calmly raised the phone higher, capturing every angle. "You've done enough," Bob said quietly. "Now it's my turn." And with that, he stepped back inside, his mind already racing through the list of contacts he'd need to call. Friends in the Postal Inspection Service, a former colleague in the state attorney's office, and a neighbor or 2 who'd likely seen the entire incident. Because one thing was certain, these men had no idea what kind of law they'd just broken. The morning after the attack on his mailbox, Bob found another surprise, this time taped right to his front door. It was an official notice, printed in oversized bold font across a poorly formatted letterhead that looked as though it had been whipped up in Microsoft Word. No HOA letterhead seal, no legal signature, no proper formatting, just a stack of vague, threatening words. $750 in fines, it claimed, citing non-compliant mailbox design and obstruction of compliance operations. Obstruction, for daring to speak up and take photos while they destroyed his federally protected property. Bob held the paper between 2 fingers, almost in disgust. He read it twice, every line dripping with bully tactics and thinly veiled threats. "So this is how they play it," he said aloud. But he already knew who was behind it. At the center of this growing storm was Mark Redding, president of the HOA board. A man known for his grandstanding speeches about community standards and a uniform neighborhood image. A man whose wife just happened to run a boutique selling HOA-compliant decorative mailboxes at several $100s apiece. For months, Mark had been pressuring longtime homeowners, especially older ones, to replace their classic USPS-registered mailboxes with these overpriced boutique models. The more people complied, the more profits flowed straight to Mark's household. Neighbors had been whispering for weeks about the so-called compliance patrols, groups of Mark's drinking buddies and off-duty contractors dressing up in matching polos and staging fake enforcement sweeps. They brandished phony badges, shouted down objections, and issued bogus fines with no real legal standing. Bob had ignored the noise. Until now. Now, they had destroyed federal property and tried to extort him under the thin veneer of community rules. His blood boiled. "These clowns think they can break federal law and get away with it," he muttered, voice low with controlled fury. But Bob wasn't just any homeowner. He was a retired postal inspector, trained in recognizing fraud and intimidation tactics, and he still had friends in the right places. He spread out the evidence on his kitchen table, photos of the smashed mailbox, photos of the men and their SUV plates, the fake fine notice, the audio recording from his phone of the encounter. This wasn't just HOA overreach, it was criminal behavior, plain and simple. Bob picked up his phone, not to call the HOA, not to argue or threaten. No, he knew that path would go nowhere. Instead, he called the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, the very federal agency empowered to investigate crimes against postal property. And then he dialed an old friend, a senior contact at the state attorney's office, someone who owed him a favor and who had a deep dislike for local corruption. The gears of justice were about to turn, and Mark Redding had no idea how far out of his depth he now was. Within 48 hours, Bob's quiet corner lot had transformed into a subtle surveillance hub. A discreet sedan with government plates appeared late Thursday morning. From it stepped a man in a plain gray suit, Inspector Thomas Kane, an old colleague from Bob's days with the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. No fanfare, no loud knocks, just a firm handshake and a quiet conversation in Bob's living room. After reviewing the photos and evidence, Kane nodded grimly. "You were right to call us, Bob. This is a clear violation of Title 18, U.S. Code Section 1705, destruction of federally protected mail receptacles. That's not a civil matter. That's a crime." Bob's jaw tightened. He'd known it, but hearing it from a current federal agent made the situation very real, and very dangerous for those responsible. But the more he dug, the worse it got. That afternoon, Bob received a visit from his neighbor, Evelyn Martinez, a widowed schoolteacher in her 70s. Her hands shook as she showed him a copy of a similar bogus compliance notice demanding $500, with a threat of a property lien if she didn't comply. "They said they'd put a lien on my house if I didn't buy the new mailbox," Evelyn whispered. "I couldn't fight them. I just paid it." Bob's stomach turned. Word spread fast after that. One by one, other neighbors, mostly elderly or single homeowners, came forward with their own stories. Dozens of them had been targeted during weekend compliance sweeps, led by none other than Mark Redding and his so-called patrols. No legal votes had been held. No official amendments to HOA rules had been passed. These were pure extortion rackets, run under the thin disguise of neighborhood beautification. "They're preying on the people least able to fight back," Bob said through gritted teeth, fists clenched at his side. "That ends now." And unlike many of his neighbors, Bob had both the experience and connections to make that happen. He sat down with his attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense litigator named Allison Pierce, and laid out everything: photos, statements, fake notices, and Kane's confirmation of the federal offense. Together, they drafted the first wave of legal strikes. The next day, Inspector Kane, after completing a field report and consulting with his chain of command, signed off on a formal federal complaint against Mark Redding and his associates: destruction of federal property and mail obstruction, both carrying serious legal consequences. At the same time, Allison filed an emergency petition with the county court, seeking a temporary restraining order against Mark and any member of his so-called patrol, citing harassment, fraud, and threats against protected residents. "We're not just going to stop them," Allison told Bob. "We're going to expose them, and they'll wish they'd never started this." Bob leaned back, his face calm but eyes burning with purpose. Good. Let's begin. 1 week later, the stage was set. It was a bright Saturday morning, another so-called compliance sweep day on the HOA calendar. Mark Redding stood in his driveway, clipboard in hand, flanked by two of his usual patrol buddies. Their black SUV idled nearby, ready for another round of door-to-door intimidation. But this time, the first vehicles to roll into the cul-de-sac weren't HOA SUVs. Two unmarked federal sedans eased to a stop in front of Mark's house. Moments later, a county sheriff's cruiser and a marked U.S. Marshal Service SUV followed. Without a word, postal inspectors accompanied by U.S. Marshals and local sheriff's deputies stepped out, badges displayed, warrant in hand. Mark barely had time to sputter a protest before the lead marshal addressed him clearly and firmly. Mark Redding, you are under arrest for multiple violations, including destruction of federal property, mail obstruction, and wire fraud related to the issuance of fraudulent compliance notices. Across the street and along the sidewalks, neighbors emerged from their porches, drawn by the unmistakable sight of federal agents moving with calm precision. Mark's face went pale. His clipboard slipped from his hand as marshals secured him in cuffs. His so-called patrol buddies, eyes wide, were separated and questioned on the spot, their fake badges and documents collected as evidence. The neighborhood, once silent in fear, now buzzed with quiet vindication. Later that afternoon, the HOA board, blindsided by the morning's events, scrambled to distance itself. In an emergency session, the board issued a formal public apology to the community, acknowledging that the Compliance Patrol had acted without legal authority or board approval. All pending enforcement actions were immediately suspended, pending a full legal review. As for Bob's mailbox, by the following Monday, a freshly installed, federally approved USPS curbside unit stood proudly in front of his home. Its installation paid for directly by Mark Redding, per an emergency court order issued by the judge overseeing the federal case. But the final chapter came that weekend. At the HOA emergency meeting, the room was packed, neighbors eager to see what would happen next. With little debate, the board voted unanimously to expel Mark Redding from the HOA leadership permanently, disband the Compliance Patrol effective immediately, initiate an independent audit of all funds collected from residents under false pretenses. As the vote was tallied, the room erupted in cheers and applause. Bob, seated quietly in the back, was soon urged to the front by a standing crowd. With a small smile, he took the microphone. "Next time someone thinks about messing with federal property," he said, voice carrying clear and steady, "they'd better bring a lawyer, or two." The room laughed, clapped, and cheered again, not just for the line, but for what it represented. A neighborhood standing tall, a bully exposed, and the law working exactly as it should.